So we're on to some details now. We talked about kind of kingdoms and domains as a whole, but now we're going to go into more specifically some of those kingdoms. And let's start off with the Protista. And I say the Protista kind of. We are going to get into the plant kingdoms as well. I will separate those into two different parts, but the Protista is kind of a kingdom in transition, in that there are many changes that are being undergone and basically new findings that are kind of taking from what we used to know and what I was taught, which is kind of crazy because as I go to teach you guys, it's actually fairly new stuff as compared to what I was taught back when I was your age. So there's a lot of new changes from what we used to know as the Kingdom Protista. So I'm going to kind of tell you a little bit about that. Alright, but before then, let's start off with some lovely visuals. Don't we all love visuals? Okay, watch this with me.
Of all the kingdoms of life, Kingdom Protista is perhaps one of the most diverse and interesting. Kingdom Protista spans from single-celled organisms with various means of locomotion and obtaining energy to huge kelp, hundreds of feet in length, that create expansive underwater forests that are home to a wide variety of marine life. But what do these diverse forms of life have in common? First, the cells of all protists have a nucleus and other complex organelles, unlike the prokaryotes of the domains Archaea and bacteria, which have neither nuclei or complex organelles. Secondly, all the members of Kingdom Protista have one or more characteristics that prevent them from being classified in kingdoms fungi, animalia, or plantae. For example, though there are protists that bear a striking resemblance to fungi, molecular analysis reveals that the cell walls of these protists are made up of cellulose, not the chitin found in all fungi. Another example is that, though a form of green algae now classified in Kingdom Protista is believed to have given rise to the members of Kingdom Plantae, the method of reproduction nevertheless differs significantly between algae and plants. Finally, though there are animal-like protists which are believed to have given rise to all the larger organisms found in Kingdom Animalia, these single-celled protists aren't classified as animals simply because, by definition, animals are multicellular. Various modes of nutrition are represented in Kingdom Protista. The algae of Kingdom Protista are autotrophs that trap solar energy and convert it to chemical energy through photosynthesis. Predatory protists like amoeba and paramecium are heterotrophs that obtain energy and nutrients by capturing and ingesting prey. Many fungi-like protists are saprotrophs, which absorb nutrients from dead or decaying organic matter, while a variety of protists are parasites. As alluded to earlier, the ancestors of modern protists are believed to have given rise to fungi, plants, and animals. To the confusion of taxonomists, many protists, such as Euglena, fit equally well into animal-like or plant-like categories. Euglena, for example, have photoreceptors and can swim toward a stimulus, features commonly associated with animals. But they use these abilities to seek light levels appropriate for photosynthesis, a process associated with plants. Thus, Protistan taxonomy is still the subject of revision and controversy. Here we group members of the Kingdom Protista into three categories: the fungus-like slime and water molds, animal-like protozoa, and the plant-like unicellular and multicellular algae.
Okay, so actually that gives us a little bit of a background for what we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth here. So I like that because even though it's a little boring, and you know me, I don't like to be boring, but it's got some good visuals and gives you a big picture of what the Kingdom Protista is like, but also some changes. Let's talk about, first of all, one thing that you're going to see in your lesson. This is a very important concept: symbiosis and stuff. And I believe you have a Watch This, Do This that is actually talking about symbiosis in a little bit greater detail. So symbiosis is an interactive relationship between two or more species that live closely together. So a great example would be your good old clownfish and the sea anemones. That typically those sea anemones are harmful and can sting you and all such, but these two live very closely together. They actually use one another. Another term is commensalism, a type of symbiosis where only one of the organisms benefit. So basically, I'm trying to think of an example right off the top of my head, but where you basically have one organism that's unharmed, but it's not really being benefited, but the other organism might be benefited by that mutual kind of living together, living in close proximity. And then you have mutualism, where both organisms benefit, okay? So those are the different types of symbiosis. Understand those definitions. You'll see them in your exam. So let's talk about a little bit back in the day. So this brings back memories for me. Back in the day when I was taught about Kingdom Protista, these are the things that we really focused on, made up of complex eukaryotic cells, unicellular cells, and multicellular. The kingdom has organisms that demonstrate both animal and plant-like characteristics, which is still true to this day. Some ingest food from the outside, which are autotrophs, or some ingest food, let me back up here. Some ingest food from the outside, okay? So those would be more your heterotrophs, where they have to go and get their food. Also, you have autotrophs, though, that produce your own food. By the way, these pictures are like back in the day, okay? Back when I was like a kid, this is what people look like. Scary. And then some members make their own food, which I just talked about as heterotrophs. I'm sorry, these are mixed up. Let's just change this. Okay, so, sorry. Autotrophs, and isn't that lovely? I can just fix this right here. Heterotrophs. If I can spell. So when you actually produce your own food, that's an autotroph, meaning auto self meaning you are feeding yourself without having to go and get your food from other sources. But the other thing is heterotrophs. A lot of the Kingdom Protista basically absorb that food from the outside. Kind of interesting, right? Okay, so let's move on. Still back in the day, protists were classified into 12 phyla, which could be placed in 3 main groups, which that video kind of talked about. They talked about the fungus-like, the plant-like, and the animal-like protists. Okay, and things have changed a little bit. So what I'm going to get into right now is what you're going to see in your lesson. So what I talked about earlier, like this good old stuff, some of it still is true today, but just know that in your lessons you might see a couple of new things that have been added to this Kingdom Protista, okay? So let's get into that. First of all, let's go through the kingdoms. And I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, give you some examples, go back to your text, read through that, and then follow that up with your details. So the Archaeozoa, Kingdom Archaeozoa, organisms placed in this proposed kingdom lacked mitochondria. Mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So basically they were not able to produce their own energy, which is kind of interesting. Okay? Some members of this group are autotrophic, others are heterotrophic. Let's first talk about the phylum Euglenophyta. Okay, Euglenophyta are those euglenias that we saw in that video. I think these are kind of cool creatures. So basically they're one-celled algae. They move with this little flagellum. Okay, so basically they have this flagella that propels them around and they're able to move. Reproduce asexually, so there's no crossing of genetic material. They basically, binary fission is how they are going to reproduce. They have a red eye spot near the end to find light. And I say, why? Well, think about it. All these green pigments, those are chlorophyll. Okay, so they have chlorophyll. They can make their own food and undergo photosynthesis. But what do you need for photosynthesis? Light. La, 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 la. So this red eye spot basically will detect the light, and these typically live in the water. So basically, it's going to float to where they can get to light sources, so they can undergo photosynthesis. Okay, so contains disc-shaped chloroplasts that I've talked about. This organelle is the site for photosynthesis. Most of you guys already know that by now, especially from Bio A. Gets its name from the presence of the green pigments, the chlorophylls. Okay, So there's the Euglenozoa. Okay, also in the, or sorry, those were the, talking about the Euglenas. Back to the kingdom Euglenozoa, okay? So we've talked a little bit about one of the phylums. Let's talk about this next phylum, Kinetoplastida, okay? Kind of crazy names, by the way. I'm not going to make you memorize all of them, but let's talk a little bit about them. Some of these can be symbiotic, and some of these are parasitic. Symbiotic, where they're going to live together with something, maybe not harm the other host or the other part in that symbiosis relationship, but some are parasites in which they will be harming. Okay, so and we'll go into a little bit more about the parasites in just a moment. Now let's move on to the kingdom Alveolata. Okay, major groups in this kingdom are the ciliates, which cilia are these tiny little microscopic hairs that basically cover this particular species. The Dinoflagellates, which are really cool, and the I can never say this right, Apicocomplexans, okay? So let's first talk about this first phylum, Ciliophora, okay? Paramecium is one of them, and some of you guys have heard of a paramecium. Unicellular slipper shaped. They look like a slipper, right? Who wears slippers still? Some of you guys might wear slippers. They are kind of slipper shaped. They move by coordinating beating of many cilia. So basically, if you could see this a little bit closer, you'd see that all around this paramecium, there are these tiny little hairs called cilia, and they kind of beat together and they move along with that, okay? They are aquatic, so they're mostly found in ponds and streams, and they usually don't cause disease in humans, usually, okay? All things have to eat, right? So in this case of a paramecium, feeding occurs in the tunnel-shaped gullet. We call it the buccal cavity, or the buccal. Wherever food is drawn in by the external and internal cilia to form this food vacuole. So basically you have this oral groove over here. Food can be drawn in and basically kind of become a part of that paramecium, and then ingest organic detritus and other small organisms like bacteria and other protozoans. So basically it kind of ingests this food, and we call this where it kind of now I'm forgetting the name, engulfs. There's a specific name, it'll come to me. But basically it's going to kind of engulf that food, bring it into the cell, and then digest it from there, okay? Alright, so just a bit more on that. Food to waste pathway. It's a very simple process. The food vacuole forming around the yeast, okay, so basically this paramecium is taking in these yeast cells, and it forms around it, and the vacuole becomes acidic so that it basically breaks it down. Then as you move through kind of this paramecium, that food is basically digested, and the alkalinity is reestablished, so then basically it's not acidic anymore. It's kind of a neutral pH, and then you have the expelling of the waste materials. So it's kind of a simple process, compared to what we go through. And then reproduction by binary fission. Remember, you have basically just a replication of just that DNA, one kind of DNA strand, and then basically that cell splits. That's binary fission. Or, though, there's another. Conjugation. We talked about that in the last lesson. So conjugation, which is kind of their sexual method, they form this like structure. It's kind of like a little tube that goes out, and it basically injects that or exchanges that genetic material, okay? So really when we talk about asexual versus sexual, we're not talking about the sex that we know. We're talking about exchanging genetic material. That's the main thing that we're talking about when we talk about how they are reproducing, okay? All right, kingdom Alveolata still, and we're going to talk about the phylum Pyrophyta. These are the Dinoflagellates and the red tides. These are really kind of cool. I'll show you some great pictures of them. But the Dinoflagellates are unicellular. Their cell walls are like plates of armor, so they're really hard to basically destroy if you'd want to. They have usually two flagella, so they spin when they move. So these two flagella, although this one's showing three, so there are some that have more than two, but I would say minimum of two flagella, and they usually spin when they move. And they're really colorful, which is kind of cool. They kind of look glassy. They can also glow in the dark, so they're really kind of these beautiful looking protists. Algae that's usually found in the oceans, that can be red tides we'll talk about, that are very actually damaging and harmful, okay? Usually brown or red in color, have hidden chlorophyll due to the dark pigments. So you can't really see the green a whole lot, because they have other pigments, but they do undergo photosynthesis. Let's talk about the red dinoflagellates. These are produced in large numbers, which turn the oceans red. This is what is responsible for red tides. If you've ever heard of red tides, it's a very toxic thing. They produce chemicals that kill thousands of fish. Okay, humans can definitely become ill if they eat fish that have absorbed this red tide within them. And they are common off the coast of Florida or other warmer areas. So these red dinoflagellates can only survive in warmer climates. Okay. Here's some more pictures of red tides. It is kind of sad because it does kill off a lot of the life forms in that area, and it's hard to get rid of. You know, these produce rapidly. So red tides, they definitely kill fish, and this poor stingray has definitely absorbed, because obviously stingrays don't have a pinkish reddish color, so they've absorbed that red tide. So after encountering and absorbing a red tide, a stingray will become slightly disoriented. They have the appearance of not being able to see or control what they're doing. Eventually the ray will stay at the surface, lying horizontally, and die. So it's kind of sad. Stingrays are really cool, by the way. I love stingrays. Okay, next the phylum Apicocomplexa, or Apicomplexa. I'm adding an extra syllable in there, and there's not. These are the parasites. These are kind of the ones that they do harm us, okay? So parasites, typically, they're going to live off of a host. And they're going to, it's kind of one of those commensalisms where, well, it's not really commensalism, because commensalism is where one of them is not benefited but not harmed. The host here is harmed, typically. So malaria is a good example of it, okay? When you have malaria, you have lots of symptoms of headaches, fever, fatigue, pain, chills, sweating, dry cough, enlargement of the spleen, nausea, vomiting, all that stuff, okay? Obviously, malaria is carried by certain kinds of mosquitoes, but here's the transmission. It's a plasmodium, we call it a sporocyte, that basically starts off in this vector, which is, you know, the mosquito, and it's going to infect the host, which is the human, okay? And all of a sudden you start to develop these liver infections, blood infections, so and so forth. And basically, anytime then you can also, basically, that blood can go into a mosquito again, which is we call the second vector, and then go on to the next human. So basically, it can be a really, really detrimental kind of a disease, but it's all due to these plasmodium, these protists that the insects carry, okay? All right, so let's go on to the amoebozoas. These are the amoebas. I think these are really cool. I mean, the pictures are kind of cool, too. But it's this single-celled organism that kind of moves and floats, okay? So it's just visible to the naked eye, so you don't necessarily need a microscope to see them. Comes from the Greek word amoeba, which is change, because it changes in shape very easily and very quickly. It is unicellular. It moves by a pseudopodia, which gives it the appearance of cell-changing size and shape. But the pseudopodias are, what pseudo is false, and podia is foot. So basically it's these false feet that kind of move out from the cell and allow it to move and look like it's changing size and shape. It is changing shape, but it's not really changing size. They are aquatic, so they tend to live in ponds, ditches, slowly moving streams. They can cause disease, something called amoebic dysentery, if you've ever heard of that. That's why a lot of times you don't want to just drink out of a stream or a pond, but you really need to filter that water, because amoebas can live in there and cause some pretty rough stuff in your stomach. Ingest small organisms like bacteria and other protozoans. Okay, so the feeding sequence. So look at this. This is again how we engulf. Okay. Oh, that's what I wanted. The term is called phagocytosis. I can't believe I forgot that name. It's kind of a crazy name. But phagocytosis is where basically, take for instance amoebas, they basically go around this food and engulf it. Okay, so phagocytosis, they move around it, and if you notice, here's where it's going to start to engulf, and it's going to go further, and then once it's inside, it closes off, and digestive enzymes are kind of released into here, and then this food particle is basically digested and broken down. Okay, that's called phagocytosis. Okay, so on to another kingdom, Stramenophila. Diatoms, giant kelp, brown algae, golden algae, mildews, and water molds are all found within this kingdom. But again, there's more phylums. So you have kingdoms. Well, first of all, you have the domains, but then you have the kingdoms and broken down into phylas or phylum, and then this is the phylum Chrysophyta. This encompasses the golden algae. Okay, these are a lot of algae that you're going to see maybe in the oceans. They're under this particular kingdom, and then different phylas. Okay, so then you have the phylum Basidiophyta, diatoms. These are another really cool. They're very beautiful, actually. They're beautiful one-celled protists. They come in many, many shapes. You have boats, rods, disc, triangles, and so forth. Important food source for water-dwelling animals. So a lot of animals actually feed off of diatoms. They're really important, but they're really kind of cool. So the cell covering is made up of two overlapping parts, kind of like a box. So you have a box, and then you have a lid that fits on top of it. That's what these cell coverings are like. And they're made up of the same material as glass. So they're very pretty. I just think they're pretty looking things. So they do not decay when they're dead, and a lot of times we use these for our own products as well. They're in toothpaste, scouring, powders, filters. Because their outer covering is kind of a glass material, it's an abrasive, but it's not too harsh so that we can actually use these. Okay, so it's kind of cool to think that, they're pretty yet they're useful. Huh. Okay, here is the phylum Phaeophyta, which is brown algae. Commonly called seaweed, so this is like your typical seaweed that you'll find. It can contain brown, green, yellow, orange, and black pigments. They usually attach to rocks. They have air bladders. So those little kind of pods. Giant kelp can be 100 meters long. That's huge. So in some of those, the oceans where you have this brown algae that just basically goes forever and ever. Okay? Used as food thickeners. Believe it or not, we use brown algae in our foods as well to thicken up things. And we do use it for food, such as, when we have good old sushi, which is my favorite. So we do eat brown algae. It's good for us. Believe it or not, algae is one of the superfoods that can absolutely do wonders in our bodies. So if you hate seaweed, it's a bummer because it's really good for you. Okay, more on the brown algae, arranged in a single layer with flagella facing outwards. So you can see, and it's crazy that sometimes you think, I'm not really touching a living creature, but you sure are. Anytime you're touching seaweed, algae, that is a living thing. They have flagella that help them move. The flagella beat and the colony spins through the water. You thought that was just the currents, didn't you? No, these are living creatures, and they're really cool. So the phylum Mycota is the last one, water molds. Okay, these are kind of crazy looking. When you look at these pictures, it looks like almost a spider web. But this type of mold does not fit in with the fungi like most people would think. These still are a part of the kingdom Protista. So water molds obviously live in water or moist places. Tiny threads that look like fuzz start to form. They attack food crops. That can be a big thing. So a lot of times these water molds can really ruin a farmer's life for that season if you have this water mold, because they will just attack crops and basically kill off. There was once, I can't remember the time period, but the Irish potato famine was a huge thing that caused a lot of the Irish to migrate to the United States, because basically they had this water mold that absolutely caused a huge famine, because potatoes were some of the staple crop that people would eat. So basically, because of this water mold, it killed off so much of that potato crop, and you had the migration of a lot of Irish. So it's kind of some historical little things. Okay, so red algae. This is the kingdom Rhodophyta. Rhodophyta consumes the red algae. They produce a moist, thick, sticky material in their cell walls. So this, they actually produce something that we use. Okay, this gelatinous substance is a source of the agar that's used to make drug capsules, dental impressions, and cosmetics, believe it or not. So if you would ever feel this red algae, you'd kind of feel this sticky. Now, if it's in the water, it's hard to obviously feel that. But if you feel that outside of the water, you can feel kind of a sticky, moist material that is basically produced by these red algae. They're multicellular. They are part of the seaweeds. They live deep in the ocean waters. They are also used in ice cream and hair conditioner. Go figure. And then they're also used in a lot of different foods in Asia. We don't typically eat a lot of red algae here. If it's in some of the dishes that maybe if you go to a Chinese restaurant or something, you might have some red algae there. But typically we are using the brown algae more than the red algae in the United States. Okay, the slime molds. This is part of the kingdom Rhodophyta as well. these look like barf, puke, who knows. Sometimes it also looks like, you know, sometimes when you're building a house and you have to fill up gaps that kind of expand with this material, that's what it kind of reminds me of too. But this is a slime mold. It's not your dog went out and puked, okay? Slime molds are fungus-like protists that are consumers. So they are not fungi, but they are fungus-like. They are heterotrophs in which they will absorb food from the outside of their bodies like typical fungi. But they're not made of the same things, okay? And I'll get to that in just a second. They typically live in cool, damp places, so like forest floors. You'll see a lot of slime molds. They look like this as well, not just those barfy looking things, kind of stringy. Also, they can look like little beads in a way. They feed on bacteria growing on rotting logs and decaying leaves. Some are parasites, okay? So they might kill off their host. They reproduce by fruiting bodies, and the fruiting bodies contain spores. So that is their mode of reproduction. At first they might look like an amoeba, but then later on they might look a little bit like a mold. And these typically, their cell walls are made of cellulose. When we talk about fungi, you'll notice that I'm speaking only of chitin in fungi. That's what their cell walls are made of, where slime molds are still cellulose. Okay, so we are done with the kingdom Protista, but let's end on some lovely music. So here's a Protista rap that I found for you, and hopefully get stuck in that head of yours.
Predators that run the night as if they were ghost riders. They don't serve anything close to providers, wrecking other organisms that are weak like produce, resurrecting through the gift of vision, meiosis, obtaining food with different techniques to capture their prey. Soon the protists won't be here to stay. Technicate the basic construct of a simple organism due to many characteristics seen in organisms, one of them being contortionism. Illest creatures eat to roam the ponds. They're the ones with no bonds, you can't stop them. When you're in the current, you're just food to them as if you were being shot at a terrorist. Selective breeding doesn't even exist in their world. They just split out of their own, not needing a boy or girl. Taxonomy classifies us all in one group, as if all the people can find us all in one soup. Animals always tend to disrupt our environment, but in the end we prevail because it's all intent.
Short and sweet, right? Okay, so you might have to rewind that and watch that again and catch the lyrics, because it really, even though it's short, he does talk a lot about the different characteristics of the protist. Okay, so that's about it for the protist, but we'll be back when we talk about kingdom Plantae and fungi. We'll talk about both those, but Plantae is coming up next. All right.